Welcome. Today, we are taking a really deep and frankly, quite unsettling look into one of the truly definitive accounts of 20th century crime. It's Helter Skelter, the true story of the Manson murders, and it's penned by the prosecutor who actually lived through it all, Vincent Bugliosi, with Curt Gentry.
Yeah, and this specific book, Helter Skelter, it's just indispensable, isn't it? Because it gives you the ultimate insider's view. It's not just, a list of what happened. It's this terrifying legal blueprint, really. It shows how law enforcement had to piece together this case against, well, a destructive cult leader and his followers.
Right.
And they were dealing with initial chaos, this really bizarre motive, and then just immense courtroom drama later on.
So our mission today is basically to follow Bugliosi's investigation, step by step, right through the book. We're going to track the whole process from that state of just total bewilderment, facing these savage, apparently random acts, all the way to the successful conviction of the people responsible. And we're talking about the deaths of 9 people here. Gary Hinman, Stephen Parent, Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, Wojtek Frykowski, Sharon Tate, Lino LaBianca, Rosemary LaBianca, and Donald Shea.
And I think it's really crucial to understand the personal toll this took on Bugliosi himself. That's something that defines the book, The source makes it incredibly clear that his commitment was just absolute. He essentially gave up his normal life for, nearly 2 years? Logging something like 100 hours of work per week. It's staggering.
100 hours a week. Wow.
Yeah, and constantly getting death threats directly from Charles Manson. He needed extreme security. His home basically became a fortress. You get the sense reading it that this was, for him, a war for justice, fought under just the highest possible pressure imaginable.
Okay, let's unpack this then, starting where Bugliosi starts. He throws the reader right into the discovery, doesn't he? Setting the scene at 150 Cielo Drive. It's Friday night, August 8th, 1969. There'd been this intense 3-day heat wave in L.A. It was finally starting to break, and that coastal fog was rolling in, giving those hills above the city this almost misleading sense of cool serenity.
That detail, the heat breaking, the fog. Bugliosi uses that masterfully. It creates this atmosphere of impending, unavoidable dread. It really is the calm before the storm, the investigative storm that's about to hit.
And the discovery itself, it started so ordinarily. The housekeeper, Winifred Chapman. She arrives early, sees this unfamiliar white Rambler parked kind of oddly. She notices the outside light was left on all night, which was unusual. So she just flips the switch off, walks past the cars, thinking maybe they were just overnight guests, until she encounters the scene. The horrific scene that brings the police.
Right. And it was the patrolmen DeRosa, Wisenhunt, and Burbridge who were the first officers there. And Bugliosi writes that even with their experience, what they found at Cielo Drive was, in blunt terms, nothing less than a human slaughterhouse. The sheer savagery of it all was just immediately apparent.
So let's move into the specifics of those Tate murders. The chaos, the confusion right afterwards. It was made worse, wasn't it, by this really unsettling contrast, the sheer brutality versus the kind of domestic normalcy they found inside the main house.
Exactly. It was a house of paradoxes, as Bugliosi describes it. There's blood evidence everywhere, suggesting this huge struggle that started inside and spilled out onto the lawn. But then the master bedroom itself is neat. The phone's untouched, just sitting calmly on the hook, and it's hard to forget the image he gives of that toy rabbit sitting on the headboard, its ears cocked as if quizzically surveying the scene, just a small, innocent detail against, absolute horror.
We probably need to detail the victims and their injuries like Bugliosi does, because the nature of the wounds became really crucial later for ruling out motives. Sharon Tate, found 8 months pregnant, 16 stab wounds. Jay Sebring, 7 stab wounds, 1 gunshot wound. And the police, in their initial digging, they found what Bugliosi calls a darker side to Sebring's life, right? Apparently involving bondage sometimes.
Yeah, and that piece of information, while sensitive, was critical because it helped solidify those early and ultimately incorrect theories. Theories about maybe a drug deal gone wrong or some kind of sadomasochistic thing.
Right. Then Abigail Folger, the coffee heiress, 28 stab wounds. Bugliosi mentioned she'd been seeing her psychiatrist, Dr. Flicker, 5 days a week. And he indicated she was really close to leaving Wojtek Frykowski.
Yeah, Frykowski, described in the book as a known Polish playboy, charming, but maybe not much else. He suffered arguably the worst brutality, 51 stab wounds and 4 gunshots. It was just so clear. This wasn't a quick, clean hit. This was prolonged, chaotic butchery.
And then there's the victim who tragically just stumbled into it all. The young man in the Rambler, initially just John Doe 85. Who was Stephen Earl Parent? What was the connection or lack thereof?
Stephen Earl Parent was just 18 years old, a hi-fi enthusiast from El Monte, apparently. He'd driven up to Cielo Drive basically just to sell a clock radio to William Garrettson, the guy living in the guest house out back. And the timing became a really important early detail. That clock radio. Found next to Parent's body in the car, it had stopped at 12:15 a.m.
12:15 a.m.
Yeah, suggesting that's roughly when he was killed, probably just before the main attack really began inside the house. He basically made it as far as his car before being shot twice.
Right.
2 more bullets or fragments were found in the car later. He was simply tragically in the wrong place at the absolute worst time.
So the early investigation, it naturally focuses heavily on the one person who survived the night there. William Garrettson, the caretaker in the guest house.
Oh, absolutely. Garrettson was the prime suspect, arrested immediately. His story was that he'd stayed up all night writing letters, listening to records, and somehow saw or heard absolutely nothing. The police, looking at the scene, reading the situation, they found this highly unlikely. I mean, how could anyone sleep through that kind of commotion?
Right.
But then Lieutenant Burdick ran a polygraph, and it ultimately cleared Garrettson of actually participating in the murders. Burdick did note, though, that Garrettson was, quote, muddy on knowledge, meaning maybe he heard something but was just too terrified to admit it, but he wasn't the killer, and that ambiguity just added another layer of confusion early on.
This raises an important question then. How did the police even begin to navigate this flood of just sensational and often totally wrong speculation? Especially with the press and public creating this instant dark mythology around the crimes.
Oh, the difficulty was enormous. Because the evidence at the scene, it contradicted any simple motive. Like you mentioned, investigators ruled out robbery almost immediately. Bugliosi lists all the valuables left untouched. Sebring's wallet with cash, more cash on Kate's nightstand, a videotape machine, Sebring's Porsche, expensive jewelry, even a big silver bowl full of pot. So clearly not about money. Then there was the drug evidence, cocaine in Sebring's car, hashish and MDA in Frykowski and Folger's room. That pointed investigators at first towards thinking maybe it was a drug burn or freakout.
And the misinformation in the press was just monumental, wasn't it? Dominating everything. False reports that Sharon Tate's unborn child was ripped out, that she was sexually mutilated, or that the victims were killed in some kind of black magic ritual called guna guna, whatever that even means.
Bugliosi details how these small facts got twisted into huge myths. Like the towel draped over Sebring's face probably just put there by the killers to silence him, or maybe just block the sight of him. The media instantly turned that into a KKK hood or some Satanist ritual hood. All this noise, this tidal wave of false speculation, it meant investigators were basically chasing ghosts instead of actual leads for weeks.
And then just 24 hours later, the terror strikes again. An event that, in hindsight, should have provided an immediate crucial link, but at the time just seemed to ramp up the alarm and confusion. Let's talk about the LaBianca homicides.
Right, the very next day, Sunday, August 10th, this time at 3301 Waverly Drive, officers Rodriguez and Tony discover Leno LaBianca, a supermarket president, in his home. And this scene was much more staged than Cielo Drive. He had a pillowcase tied over his head, an ivory-handled carving fork was stuck brutally into his stomach, a knife plunged into his throat. And maybe most disturbingly, the word war was carved directly into his naked flesh.
God. And his wife, Rosemary LaBianca, also suffered numerous stab wounds, 28, the book says. And crucially, just like at the Tate house, robbery was definitively ruled out again. Valuables left untouched. Expensive jewelry, handguns, shotguns, rifles, a coin collection. No sign of forced entry, though the back door was apparently easy to jimmy. The staging, the writing, the number of victims, it just blew that initial drug burn theory completely out of the water, didn't it?
Absolutely. And what connected these crimes, what should have connected them immediately, were the bloody writings. It created this terrifying trifecta of violence. Bugliosi really needed to hammer home in the trial that these weren't random scribbles, they were organized messages. So you have 3 separate homicides with messages left in the victim's blood. Gary Hinman's scene back on July 31st, it was political piggy.
Right.
At the Tate house, it was pig on the front door, written in Sharon Tate's blood. And then at the LaBianca residence, death to pigs and critically Helter Skelter.
Okay, so with this repetition, especially the pig motif, this really should have been the moment the dots connected across the different police departments. But the sources, Helter Skelter particularly, reveal this systemic failure, right? A serious disconnect between LAPD handling Tate and LaBianca and the LA County Sheriff's Office, LASO, which handled the Hinman murder.
That disconnect was absolutely critical, and it might have tragically cost the LaBiancas their lives. LSO Sergeants Whiteley and Gunther, they were on the Hinman case. They had already told LAPD about their suspect, Bobby Beausoleil, who was a known Manson associate, and about the political Pidgeotty writing. But the Tate detectives, maybe they were caught up in the celebrity aspect, the sensationalism, or maybe blinded by all the drug evidence at Cielo Drive. They didn't immediately follow up on that information. They failed to see the significance of the pig theme being repeated across jurisdictions until much, much later. It was a kind of, as Bugliosi implies, institutional tunnel vision, a lack of communication that just left the door wide open for the killers to strike again.
So given tsunami of investigative hurdles, the interagency problems, where did the investigators finally get a real thread of truth? Because the case didn't break because of forensics connecting the scenes, did it? It broke months later through Susan Atkins Sadie, as they called her, and her unofficial confessions while she was locked up at Sybil Brand Jail for the Hinman murder.
Here's where it gets really interesting, as you said. Two informants, Virginia Graham, who actually knew J. Sebring casually, interestingly enough, and Ronnie Howard, they start hearing Atkins talk. And she was apparently just loose with the details, almost boasting. Bugliosi describes her as jumping from subject to subject as if she was tripping out. This wasn't like a formal interrogation. This was just jailhouse chatter that turned into investigative gold.
And Atkins' admissions to Virginia Graham were just chilling. She apparently admitted that he, presumably Tex Watson or Manson, cut the phone wires at Cielo Drive and that he knew just what to do, maybe implying he'd been there before. And then came that boast, delivered with this casual pride. We knocked off 5 of them just the other night. The timeline eventually made it clear to Bugliosi she was talking about the Tate killings, that she was there.
Exactly. And then to Ronnie Howard, Atkins basically confirmed everything Bugliosi needed. She confirmed she was at Tate's and that she printed the word pig on the door, dipping a towel right into Sharon Tate's blood. And when Ronnie Howard asked her, what stabbing felt like, Susan, apparently pleased that Ronnie got her mindset, replied, "It was just like going into nothing, going into air."
Unbelievable.
Yeah. And she also confirmed the LaBianca writings, including that key, crucial phrase. "Don't you remember that guy that was found with a fork in his stomach? We wrote arise and death to pigs and helter skelter in blood."
Wow. So those confessions, as shocking as they were, finally gave Bugliosi and the DA's office the motive, the direction they desperately needed. But initially, the police hierarchy, specifically LAPD Chief Davis, they actually wanted to grant Susan Atkins immunity for her testimony, right? A move Bugliosi fought hard against.
Oh, absolutely. Bugliosi saw immediately how serious her admissions were. He insisted, and he quotes himself in the book, "If what she told Ronnie Howard is true, Atkins personally stabbed to death Sharon Tate, Gary Hinman, and who knows how many others. We don't give that gal anything." He couldn't get past her reaction to the violence, her description of the stabbing, her complete lack of basic humanity. It was encapsulated in that phrase she used afterwards. Wow, what a trip. That just cemented it for him. She wasn't just present. She was a willing, enthusiastic participant.
So this brings us to the ultimate question, the one everyone still asks, and the one Bugliosi absolutely had to answer for the jury. Why? Why commit these atrocious, seemingly meaningless murders? And the answer, according to Helter Skelter, lies entirely in Charles Manson's bizarre philosophy and this terrifying prophetic interpretation he had of a coming race war he called Helter Skelter.
Right. Manson himself, as the book details, was this profoundly damaged person, a career criminal, really. Spent 17 years of his life in institutions, reformatories, prisons, born no-name Maddox, physically small, only 5'2", released from prison in 1967, and he quickly sets up the family in Haight-Ashbury, and he starts projecting himself as the spiritual guru, or even audaciously as Jesus Christ. He even used the sound of his name, Manson, to imply this.
And his philosophy was just utterly destructive, wasn't it? Especially about gender and race. Manson claimed women only had 2 purposes: serve men, bear children. Though he didn't let his followers raise those children, right?
Yeah.
Believing parents just pass on their own hang-ups.
Yeah.
And he was obsessed with purity, with developing, in his mind, a strong white race.
Yes. And the sources, including Bugliosi's account, indicate Manson openly admired Adolf Hitler. He called Hitler a tuned-in guy who had leveled the karma of the Jews. Manson was this strange, eclectic borrower of ideas. He sort of mashed together Nietzsche's concept of the master race with these distorted Christian prophecies and bits of the counterculture ideology floating around. And he used this toxic cocktail of ideas to basically justify the violence he was planning.
But the central motive, the core driver, the one Bugliosi had to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, came from this completely wild interpretation of the Beatles' 1968 White Album. Manson genuinely believed these songs were direct prophecies, talking only to him, signaling this impending race war helter-skelter.
He was utterly convinced that the black man symbolized by references like Rocky Raccoon in the songs was going to rise up and kill all the white people, who he called piggies. And the family, who he saw as the original Christians reincarnated, they would hide out in the desert in this bottomless pit he talked about. Then, after the black man had won the war and presumably killed most white people, the family would emerge to take over leadership because the remaining whites would need guidance. It's just bizarre.
And he twisted specific songs to fit this narrative, didn't he? Blackbird was supposedly telling the black man to arise. Happiness is a warm gun was telling Blackie to get guns and fight Whitey, who used piggies, obviously. And the song Helter Skelter itself, with its chaotic energy, symbolized the coming war for him.
Exactly. And Manson apparently believed the only reason this predicted race war hadn't kicked off yet was because, in his words, Whitey was feeding his young daughters to the black man in Haight-Ashbury, meaning the counterculture mixing was diluting racial tension. So his perverse solution was he had to show Blackie how to do it. By committing these atrocious racially charged crimes, the stabbing, the cutting, smearing blood, riding pigs in wealthy white neighborhoods, he thought by framing black people for these murders, he could ignite the race war he believed was necessary and prophesied.
Which brings us to the really crucial point of Manson's control. How on earth did he convince these, seemingly normal young people, many from middle-class homes, to become his killers, to sacrifice their own humanity for this apocalyptic fantasy?
Well, Manson wasn't just charismatic in the usual sense. Bugliosi portrays him as a highly sophisticated psychological predator. He exploited deep-seated voids in people. Paul Watkins, one of the followers who eventually testified against him, observed that Charlie was always selling fear. He had this almost uncanny knack for sensing a person's deepest insecurities or desires, whether it was a need for acceptance, a father figure, or just radical spiritual answers, and he'd latch on to that immediately.
And he used drugs heavily too, right? LSD, other psychoactives, to kind of open their minds, make them suggestible.
Yes, immense amounts of LSD. Then he'd talk endlessly about surrendering the ego, becoming one with everything, trying to break down their individual will. Watkins recalled this really frightening incident where Manson actually started strangling him. But the instant Paul stopped resisting, stopped fearing him, just accepted what might happen, Manson immediately recoiled, as if hitting some invisible wall. Manson's technique seemed built on systematically removing the follower's will to resist him.
And the devastating success of that manipulation. You see it in the complete lack of remorse from the female killers, as Bugliosi highlights. Leslie Van Houten later commenting that she found the more you stabbed, the more fun it was. Susan Atkins seeing the whole thing as just a trip. It's chilling. It shows total psychological capture.
Absolutely. These were individuals who came to see Manson as the only one reflecting their deepest needs back at them. They'd completely forfeited their own capacity for moral judgment to him.
Okay, so with this incredibly complex motive finally identified, Bugliosi faced this monumental legal task, proving Manson commanded the killings, especially since Manson wasn't even at the Tate murders, and Tex Watson was the main killer at both scenes. This is where the legal strategy had to get really intricate, didn't it?
Yes, the prosecution's entire success basically hinged on securing the testimony of Linda Kasabian. She was the one who accompanied the killers on both nights. Bugliosi was, well, essentially forced to grant her immunity. It was highly controversial, people didn't like it, but he saw it as absolutely necessary. Without her eyewitness account, getting convictions, especially against Manson, who just ordered the acts, would have been almost impossible. It was a conspiracy case. He essentially had to trade one potential conviction, Kasabian's, to secure the convictions of the entire family leadership involved in the murders.
So Linda's testimony became the absolute foundation of the case. She established that Manson ordered the killings on August 8th, telling the group explicitly, now is the time for Helter Skelter. That made Manson directly liable. And she testified he directed the LaBianca murders the next night too, saying clearly, this time I'm going to show you how to do it.
Her role was just indispensable. She was the driver, the witness. She detailed those horrific crimes, seeing Patricia Krenwinkel or Katie, chasing Abigail Folger, seeing Tex Watson stabbing Frykowski repeatedly. And crucially, Linda provided vital physical corroboration that linked Manson directly to the planning in the scene. She led police to where they disposed of the bloody clothes and weapons, and she identified those big red wire cutters found in Manson's own doom buggy as the exact tool used to cut the phone lines at Cielo Drive. That link between the tool used for the crime and Manson's personal vehicle was huge.
But beyond Linda's crucial testimony, Bugliosi still needed hard physical evidence, scientific links, to tie the individual family members directly to those two crime scenes.
And that evidence, though it was often fragmented, was pieced together painstakingly. Like Patricia Krenwinkel's little fingerprint, for instance. It matched the latent print they lifted from the frame of the French door in the Tate master bedroom. Tex Watson's prints were also found near that same door. And Bugliosi explains in the book that the absence of Susan Atkins' prints wasn't necessarily proof she wasn't there. He notes that in something like 70% of crime scenes, police don't get any readable prints at all. So the lack of print evidence for her was, quote, more common than uncommon. He had to make sure the jury understood that.
And then there was the gun, the key weapon linking the scenes. That .22 Longhorn revolver with the distinctively broken grip found by that 11-year-old boy, Stephen Weiss.
Right. That gun was positively matched ballistically to the bullet recovered from Jay Sebring's body. And furthermore, Danny DiCarlo, another family associate, corroborated that Manson and others used to target practice with that specific gun, the one with the broken grip, up at Spahn Ranch. So that established a clear chain of custody and use, putting the murder weapon firmly in the family's possession around the time of the crimes.
The trial itself then became this just unparalleled spectacle, defined largely by Manson's deliberate courtroom antics, all designed to just undermine the whole judicial process.
Oh, the chaos was constant. Manson treated the courtroom like his personal stage. He famously shaved his head and beard mid-trial, claiming he was the devil, and the devil had to be bald. He engaged in just bizarre, aggressive behavior, like leaping over the counsel table towards Judge Older, clutching a sharpened pencil, shouting things like, I will have you removed if you don't stop. I have a little system of my own. And the women followed his lead, didn't they? Shaving their heads, carving X's into their foreheads in court, showing their loyalty and just utter contempt for the proceedings.
And the defense was equally chaotic, primarily driven by Irving Kanarek, Manson's lawyer. Bugliosi describes his tactics as extreme obstructionism.
Yeah, obstructionism basically meant Kanarek generated hundreds and hundreds of frivolous objections. Objecting to the shape of court papers, demanding non-controversial testimony be read aloud from transcripts, anything to slow things down and frustrate the prosecution. It forced Bugliosi to fight tooth and nail for almost every single piece of evidence, even simple stuff. This legal filibustering just added massive amounts of time and complexity to an already long trial.
And they also tried to float that, frankly, ridiculous copycat motive theory, didn't they? Claiming Linda Kasabian had somehow masterminded the Tate LaBianca murders herself. The idea being she wanted to make the police think the Hinman murder was related.
Right, it was a desperate, self-serving defense theory. Bugliosi writes about how we pretty easily demolished it because it was just internally inconsistent and made no logical sense given the evidence and Linda's own testimony and demeanor.
And we can't forget the external political pressure cooker either. President Nixon actually commented publicly during the trial that Manson was guilty.
Yeah, that caused a huge headache. It led to this extensive voir dire, that's the process of questioning potential jurors, just to make absolutely sure the jury pool hadn't been tainted by the president, basically declaring Manson guilty before the verdict.
And interestingly, Bugliosi notes in the book that the jurors, because they felt they were the ones hearing all the actual evidence firsthand, were actually kind of annoyed with Nixon for trying to, usurp their role. So ironically, that outside interference might have accidentally made the jury even more determined to be meticulously fair to Manson, to give him every benefit of the doubt, which just meant Bugliosi's job was even harder.
It was an incredibly long, complex trial. Bugliosi mentions the sheer volume, the exhibits, the transcripts, 40 additional volumes of transcript just from the later Watson trial alone. But ultimately, the prosecution did succeed. They proved Manson's control, and critically, they proved the women's willing participation in the acts.
Bugliosi's final argument really hammered home that point about their culpability, didn't it? Focusing on their moral choice. He argued they weren't suffering from diminished mental capacity, despite what defense psychiatrists tried to suggest about LSD use.
Yeah.
He argued it was a diminished heart, a diminished soul. He framed it as pure evil volition.
Exactly. And interestingly, Leslie Van Houten's attorney, Maxwell Keith, who had a much more conservative, traditional approach compared to the others, he actually delivered arguably the most effective defense for his client by acknowledging Manson's domination. He compared his clients, the women, to hired killers, arguing that even if they were following orders, they couldn't use obedience as a defense. Keith essentially put the hat on Charles Manson, albeit with a 10-foot pole, as Bugliosi puts it. He acknowledged Manson was the puppeteer, but confirmed the physical killers still bore full responsibility.
And that really is the chilling synthesis of the case, isn't it? And Bugliosi's ultimate victory in court. The unique terror here wasn't just the number of victims, horrible as that was. It was Manson's ability to command others to kill for him. As the source notes, because Manson could control others, get them to act out his rage, the threat they posed felt exponentially more frightening than any single killer acting alone.
And the book, especially later editions, discusses the immense cultural and historical legacy of these murders way beyond the courtroom. These events are just widely seen as this watershed moment, marking the definitive end of innocence. That point when the whole 60s vibe of love, peace, and sharing suddenly seemed terrifyingly naive, even dangerous.
Yeah, it's that point Joan Didion made so powerfully. She wrote, "Many people I know in Los Angeles believe that the 60s ended abruptly on August 9th, 1969. The dream of the counterculture was just brutally stabbed to death on Cielo Drive."
And the murders cast this incredibly long shadow that frankly continues today. Bugliosi Manson received more mail than any other inmate in U.S. prison history. He remained this perverse spiritual icon for certain marginalized groups, neo-Nazis, Satanists. Shockingly, the book mentions that followers under 25, even years later, sometimes showed strong approval of the whole Helter Skelter philosophy.
And we see the aftermath for the convicted family members detailed in the book, too. Leslie Van Houten, Patricia Krenwinkel, Susan Atkins, all initially sentenced to death, later commuted to life when California briefly abolished the death penalty. Krenwinkel, years later in prison, expressed deep remorse and confirmed Manson's total control. She stated flatly, "Charlie is absolutely lying. There wasn't one thing done that was even allowed to be done without his express permission."
And the fates of the survivors, those who weren't convicted of murder, are just as fascinating. Charles Tex Watson, the main killer, he renounced Manson in prison, became a born-again Christian, even started a ministry. Linda Kasabian, the star witness, obviously had to live under an assumed name. Others, like Barbara Hoyt, became a registered nurse. Diane Lake, who was sort of taken under the wing of a sheriff's investigator, became a committed Christian, got married, had kids. They managed to escape the family's orbit, proving it was possible, which is maybe a small glimmer of hope in all this darkness.
So what does this all mean for you today, having gone through this dive into Bugliosi's definitive, terrifying account?
It really confirms this terrifying realization. Manson's so-called magic, his control, it wasn't hypnosis or anything supernatural. It was simply this chilling ability to identify the deep-seated needs and voids in other people. That desire for acceptance, the need for a father figure, the search for a leader. He found those voids and he exploited them for horrific purposes. It was pure emotional leverage and psychological warfare.
That really is the truly chilling takeaway that Bugliosi leaves us with, isn't it? The book describes Manson's belief that he was breaking down his followers' ego barriers. So if Manson's power relied on finding those deepest voids in people that need for belonging, the search for absolute truth, the raw desire for acceptance, it makes you wonder what psychological or societal voids exist today that might make people susceptible to a charismatic, destructive leader. That's something for you to maybe mull over or explore on your own as you process the true story of Helter Skelter.
Thank you for joining us.